In life, pride comes before the fall. Sometimes, the way we treat those who have the least reveals everything about who we really are. And Richard Carrington was about to learn that lesson the hard way. It was a bustling afternoon in Los Angeles. The sidewalks overflowed with people, cars honked impatiently, and the city pulsed with its usual rush. But amid the noise, one man sat quietly on a curb. His jacket was worn, his shoes scuffed, and in his hands he held nothing more than a small bag of groceries, a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk. This man wasn't begging, he wasn't holding a sign, he wasn't asking for handouts. He simply sat there with quiet dignity, as though what little he had was enough. And that's when Richard Carrington walked by. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was arrogant. A self-made millionaire in real estate, he carried himself like the city belonged to him. His tailored suit was worth more than some people made in a month. He strutted down the street with his business partners laughing beside him, bragging about the deal he had just closed, another of homes about to be bulldozed for profit. When Richard's eyes landed on the man with the groceries, he slowed down. A smirk spread across his face. Well, Richard said loudly, making sure others heard. Look at this guy, sitting here like a piece of trash. What's the matter, buddy? Can't even afford a bus ticket home. His partners chuckled. Even his assistant forced a laugh. The man looked up calmly and said, "Good afternoon, sir." That simple politeness only fueled Richard's arrogance. "Good afternoon," Richard scoffed. "Tell me, how much did those groceries cost you? $10, maybe 12. That's your empire right there. Meanwhile, I closed a deal this morning worth $8 million. The man didn't flinch. He just held his bag tighter and said quietly, "You shouldn't measure a man by what's in his pocket, but by what's in his heart." Richard rolled his eyes. "Spare me the wisdom talk. If you had anything worth saying, you wouldn't be sitting in rags. Men like me, we make things happen. Men like you, you're just in the way." But the man only gave a faint smile, almost as if he knew something Richard didn't. "Life has a way of humbling even the proudest men, sir." Richard laughed mockingly, pulled out a crumpled dollar, and tossed it at his feet. "Here, don't spend it all at once." His friends roared with laughter, but the man never reached for the dollar. He just looked at Richard with piercing eyes that seemed to say, "You'll regret this." That night, as Richard poured himself a drink in his penthouse overlooking the city, those words echoed in his mind. Life has a way of humbling even the proudest men. He shook them off, dismissing them as nonsense. But the very next morning, those words would come back to haunt him. Because when Richard arrived at a private investor's breakfast at the most exclusive country club in town, his world tilted. Across the room, dressed in a sharp suit, confidently shaking hands with the city's elite, was the same man he had mocked just hours earlier. Richard froze in shock. No, it can't be him. The man turned, locked eyes with him, and smiled. Richard thought he had humiliated a nobody, but he was about to find out that this man wasn't who he seemed, and the truth was about to shake Richard's empire to its very core. And when you hear what happens next, you won't believe it. Richard's confidence shattered the moment he saw the man again. Just yesterday, he was convinced this stranger was a nobody, barely worth a dollar. But now, here he was, seated among Los Angeles' most powerful investors, laughing, shaking hands, and commanding respect. Richard's palms began to sweat. He could hardly focus on the breakfast meeting. Every time he glanced across the room, those same piercing eyes were watching him. Calm, unbothered, almost amused. After the event, Richard cornered him outside the hall. "Who are you? What game are you playing?" The man smiled faintly, extending his hand. "My name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm not playing a game, Richard. I'm here because the past has a way of catching up." Richard stiffened. "The past? What are you talking about?" Daniel's tone sharpened. "Years ago, you promised dozens of families affordable housing, families who trusted you. My family was one of them." Richard's face hardened, but his chest tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. That was business." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "It wasn't just business. It was people's lives. You bulldozed our homes, pocketed the money, and walked away. My father's health crumbled under the stress. My mother spent nights crying because she lost the only home she ever knew. And me, I was left watching everything we loved fall apart." For once, Richard had no clever comeback. His mouth went dry. "Listen, I I didn't know it was your family. It was a long time ago. Daniel interrupted, his voice cold and deliberate. You didn't care to know. And now, after all these years, I've built myself back up, without your money, without your help, and now I'm standing right here. Richard forced a laugh, trying to mask his unease. So what, you're successful now, good for you. But don't think for a second you can come after me. I've built an empire that no one can touch. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying Richard the way a lion studies its prey. Empires fall, Richard, and sometimes all it takes is one truth to bring it all crashing down. Richard clenched his jaw, trying to stand taller, to reassert his power. Whatever you think you have on me, you'd better forget it, because if you try to cross me, I'll bury you so deep, no one will ever hear your name again. But Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for Richard to hear. You've already buried yourself. You just don't know it yet. Those words hit Richard harder than he wanted to admit. For the first time in years, he felt a chill run down his spine. That night, back at his penthouse, Richard couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying Daniel's words. You've already buried yourself. He poured another glass of scotch, staring at the city lights below. Was this man bluffing, or did he really have the power to undo everything? Richard didn't know it yet. But Daniel Hayes wasn't finished, not even close. Richard thought the past was behind him, but Daniel was only getting started. And the next move he made would strike Richard where it hurt the most. When you see what Daniel does next, you'll understand why Richard should have never laughed at him. For the next few days, Richard tried to convince himself that Daniel's sudden reappearance meant nothing. After all, Richard was at the top of his game. Millions in the bank, skyscrapers in his portfolio, and politicians on his payroll. One man couldn't possibly shake that. But Richard was wrong, because 3 days later, at a crucial board meeting with his top investors, the door opened, and in walked Daniel Hayes. Richard nearly dropped his pen. What is he doing here? He muttered under his breath. The chairman of the board smiled warmly. Ah, Mr. Carrington, I see you've met our newest investor. Daniel Hayes has just acquired a significant stake in the company. Richard's blood ran cold. He slammed his fist on the table. This is ridiculous. Who approved this? The chairman looked confused. The board did. Daniel brings credibility and resources. He's exactly the kind of partner we need. Daniel sat down across from Richard, his calm demeanor unshaken. Relax, Richard. I'm not here to fight you, not today. I'm here to watch, to listen, to learn. After all, a man should know the empire he intends to. He paused, then smiled faintly. Inherit. Richard's face flushed red. You think you can come in here and play games with me? You don't know who you're dealing with. Daniel's voice was low, but sharp as a knife. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who's built his fortune on lies, manipulation, and broken promises. And I know something else too, Richard. Sooner or later, every empire built on sand collapses. The room fell, silent. Richard's investors glanced at each other nervously. Doubt began to spread like wildfire. After the meeting, Richard stormed out, grabbing Daniel by the arm. Listen to me, you smug little nobody. You think you can waltz into my world and take what's mine, Lynn. You'll fail. You'll lose. And when you do, I'll crush you. Daniel pulled his arm free and looked Richard dead in the eyes. You already lost, Richard. The difference is, I'm just here to make sure you see it happen. That night, Richard couldn't escape the unease gnawing at him. For the first time in years, he felt out of control. The press was sniffing around one of his past developments. A whistleblower had come forward. And now, with Daniel in the picture, investors were beginning to question their loyalty. Richard tried to reassure himself, pacing the marble floor of his penthouse. He's bluffing. He has nothing. He can't touch me. But deep down, he knew Daniel wasn't bluffing. He had a plan. And that plan was about to strike at the heart of everything Richard valued: his reputation, his empire, and his legacy. Richard thought he could scare Daniel off, but Daniel wasn't after fear. He was after justice. And in his next move, Daniel would uncover a devastating secret, one that tied Richard to a tragedy he could never escape. When you learn the truth Daniel reveals, you'll see why Richard's downfall was already written. Richard Carrington had always been untouchable, or at least, that's what he believed. But Daniel Hayes was proving him wrong. Within weeks of joining the board, Daniel began to quietly influence key investors. He didn't shout or boast. He simply laid out facts. Facts Richard had long hoped were buried. Construction shortcuts, unsafe materials, families displaced and left homeless. Slowly, whispers began to circulate, and those whispers grew into headlines. The media picked up the story. One evening, Richard turned on the TV to see his face plastered on every news channel. Millionaire accused of fraudulent dealings. Carrington under fire for neglecting families. His name, once a symbol of wealth and success, was now smeared with scandal. At first, Richard laughed it off. Bad press doesn't stick to me. It never has. But then the protests began. Outside his offices, crowds gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Families" and "Carrington lies, people die." Investors pulled out. Clients canceled deals. And for the first time in his career, Richard's empire began to tremble. One night, unable to sleep, Richard drove to one of the neighborhoods he had demolished years ago. What used to be homes filled with families was now just an empty lot, fenced off and forgotten. The silence was deafening, and that's when he heard a voice behind him. "I used to play here as a boy," Daniel said quietly. He had been waiting. "That swing set over there, it was my brother's favorite." Richard's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Daniel's eyes glistened with something Richard couldn't name: grief, anger, pain. "When you tore down our home, my father worked himself sick trying to fight you. He died 2 months later. My mother never recovered. But the worst was my brother. He was just 16. He blamed himself for not being able to help. One night, he left, and we never saw him again." Richard swallowed hard, suddenly short of breath. That wasn't my fault. He made his own choices." Daniel's voice rose, raw and sharp. "No, Richard. You made the choices. You chose greed over people, profit over lives, and my family paid the price." For a moment, Richard had no words. The weight of Daniel's story pressed against him like a boulder. But then, in true Richard fashion, he straightened his tie and forced a smirk. Touching story. But at the end of the day, life isn't fair. Some people win, some people lose. That's just how the world works. Daniel's jaw tightened. "No, Richard, that's how you work. But tomorrow, the world will see you for who you really are." And with that, Daniel walked away, leaving Richard alone in the darkness of the empty lot, his empire unraveling, his secrets exposed, and his conscience clawing at him. Richard thought the worst was over. But Daniel was about to make his final move, a move that would not only destroy Richard's empire, but force him to confront the one truth he could never outrun. And when you hear Daniel's last revelation, it will leave you speechless. The morning sun rose over Los Angeles, but for Richard Carrington, the day felt darker than ever. Overnight, his name had become toxic. Investors pulled out of every deal. Reporters camped outside his gates. Protesters flooded the sidewalks. The empire Richard built brick by brick was collapsing. And Daniel Hayes was at the center of it all. Richard stormed into his office, slamming the door shut. His assistant trailed behind, trembling. "Sir, the board has called an emergency vote. They're removing you as CEO." Richard's face went pale. "They can't do that. This is my company." But even as he spoke, the boardroom doors opened, and there sat Daniel, calm, composed, waiting. Richard's chest tightened. You did this." Daniel's voice was steady. "No, Richard, you did this. You buried people under your greed. All I did was bring the truth to light." Richard slammed his hands on the table. "You think this is justice? You ruined me." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze unshakable. "You ruined yourself. But there's something you don't know, Richard, something I've kept until now." Richard froze. "What are you talking about?" Daniel's voice softened, but every word struck like thunder. "Remember my brother, the one I told you about, the boy who disappeared after you destroyed our home. He was just 16, and the night he left, he came here. He begged for a chance, a job, a way to help my mother. Do you remember, Richard? Because I do. You looked him in the eye, and you laughed." Richard's face went white. His knees buckled. He remembered. A scrawny teenager, desperate, clutching a worn resume. He had mocked him, told him to get lost, and had his security escort him out. That boy was Daniel's brother. "He never came home," Daniel whispered. His voice cracked, but his stare never wavered. "We searched for weeks. Police found him later, in a shelter across town. Broken, hopeless. He didn't survive the winter." The boardroom fell silent. Some looked away, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. Prep it. Others glared at Richard with disgust. Richard sank into his chair, trembling. I didn't know. I didn't mean. Daniel's eyes glistened with both pain and resolve. Intent doesn't erase impact, Richard. Your greed killed my family, and now the world finally sees you for who you are. Richard's voice broke. Please, Daniel, don't do this. Don't take everything from me. Daniel stood tall, straightening his jacket. I'm not taking anything. I'm just letting truth take its course. By that afternoon, Richard Carrington was officially removed as CEO. His assets frozen, his reputation destroyed. Reporters swarmed as he left the building. No limo, no entourage, just a fallen man swallowed by the weight of his own pride. And Daniel, he walked away, not in triumph, but with quiet dignity. He hadn't wanted revenge. He wanted accountability. And at last, he had it. Pride blinded Richard until it was too late. He laughed at a man he thought was beneath him, never realizing that man would be the very one to humble him. Life has a way of catching up with us all. So what's the lesson here? Never underestimate others. Treat people with dignity, no matter their position, because the same people you look down on today may be the ones who stand above you tomorrow. Viewers, what do you think? Should Richard have faced even harsher consequences, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe so you never miss the next story, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from?